everybody, welcome back to Biblical Greek Made Easy. This is class 10 of module 2, and today we're going to start to learn participles. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but let's start out with the scripture verse of the day, okay? Matthew chapter 16 verse 17 says, Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Okay, and there's a number of verses I could have picked here. We'll talk in a little bit about why I picked this one, but there's actually a participle hiding in this verse that's a really common way it's used in the New Testament. I want to show you that in just a little bit. But before we do that, here's the tip of the day. The tip of the day is to wade into the participle pool slowly. All right, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this in just a second. Let me tell you two stories as we get started today, okay? Many moons ago when I was learning Greek, and I got to this point in the curriculum, I was reading quite a bit. I was reading the New Testament at least every few days. I was practicing a lot. If you're up with the vocabulary, you know a large percentage of words in the New Testament. You know a lot of the grammar, and that's where I was, and I was feeling pretty confident in my reading ability as I was plowing through. But as I would read the New Testament, I felt like every fifth word or so was a participle, and I didn't know participles yet, okay? And so I'd read for a little bit, and I'd see a participle, I'd have to look it up, and I'd read a little bit further, and I'd see a participle, I'd have to look it up. And I got to this point where I said, man, if I only knew participles, like, I'd be killing the New Testament, you know? I'd be doing so much better. I feel like those are the roadblocks I run into all the time. Would somebody please teach me participles? Because they're all over the place, okay? So I'm not sure if you feel like that or not, but you may have noticed that there's participles, you know, a fair amount in the New Testament. And eventually we just have to deal with them. We have to learn them, okay? Story number 2 has to do with our tip of the day, to wade into the pool slowly. Wade into the participle pool slowly. And here's why. When I teach this at a college and a seminary level, this is usually kind of a tension point in the semester, okay? We're about 3/4, 2/3, somewhere in there of the way through the semester. The students have just been slogging through verbs for a couple months, where they've been learning a new layer every week, essentially. And they get to this point somewhere in the middle where it's maybe like midterm time or just a little bit after midterm time, and they've got papers due, and there's lots of forces kind of, you know, taking their time and putting pressure on them and all that kind of stuff. And then we get to participles, which are pretty complex. They've got a lot going on. It's not a whole lot of new stuff, but it's kind of synthesizing stuff that you already know in new ways, which can be kind of challenging and difficult. So when we get to this point at a university or a seminary, we just kind of intentionally calm things down a little bit. And what I mean by that is we slow down the pace, okay? We don't have quizzes and tests that are due for grades for a few weeks. We just kind of have this moment, this oasis in the middle of the semester where we say, guys, let's just hang out, let's chill, let's learn participles at our own pace, and we'll come out on the other side and you'll feel good about it, and we'll be in the right spot, you know? And so, of course, you're always able to do that with Biblical Greek Made Easy. You can always take a little break. You can always slow down. My encouragement continues to be to keep moving. Don't put it down too long because it's hard to come back. But don't rush through participles. Take your time. Watch the videos a couple times if you need to. Do the practices a couple times. But just wade into that pool slowly, okay? So let's go ahead and talk about why this matters. And it's kind of what I mentioned a little bit ago, is that knowing participles is essential to reading and translating New Testament Greek, right? These are just a common feature in the New Testament and language, more than we encounter them in English. And so for that reason, we just need to know them. We need to deal with them. We need to reckon with them. And actually, maybe you'll notice, like I did, that when you learn participles, it takes your ability to read and translate to that next level because they show up so much. Second, we're going to break the system down and make a difficult topic as easy as possible. Okay, so like I said, there's a lot going on, and it's synthesized in a new kind of way, but we're going to break it down for you and make it as simple as possible. All right? So with that, let's go ahead and do an introduction into participles. So participles are English words ending in ing. Okay, so like walking, talking, kicking, punching, throwing, etc., right? In English, any word essentially that ends in ing, that's a verb with an ing on the end, is a participle, okay? Now, Mount says about participles, it is essential to learn the Greek participle if you are to translate the New Testament with any proficiency. Participles are common and important, okay? And that is definitely true. You'll see how common they are and how important they are. Now, another thing to learn about participles right away is that participles are versatile, okay? They can do a lot of different things. They're certainly more versatile in Greek than they are in English, okay? And so what do we mean by versatile? Well, let me give you an analogy. I'm a football fan, I have been for a long time. I've been a long-time fan of the Rams. They were the St. Louis Rams when I became a follower, and now they've moved to LA, so it's the LA Rams. But one of my all-time favorite Rams players is a guy named Marshall Faulk, okay? And he was this running back that was kind of an interesting hybrid. He's in the Hall of Fame, and he has more receiving yards as a running back than a lot of Hall of Fame receivers do from back in the day, right? So he could run like a running back, he could catch like a receiver, he could block, he could run inside for power, he could run outside for speed. He was really smart and, kind of like a coach on the field. So he was just like, he could do everything. He was just this, five-tool player, that sort of thing. And I remember back in the days when he played, hearing defenders like Warren Sapp and people like that being interviewed about Marshall Faulk and just how good he was, and they would say things like that, like he doesn't have any weaknesses, he's just good at everything, And that's kind of my metaphor for participles, is that participles can do a lot of different things. They're really versatile. They can be used in different ways, and so that can be your metaphor going into this lesson, is just thinking that, these are the Marshall Faulk of grammar, because they can do a lot of different things well, okay? And so the Greek participle is a grammatical hybrid, okay? What do we mean by that? Well, it takes on the nature of a verb and an adjective, okay? / noun, okay? In some ways, it behaves like an adjective or a noun in the sense that it's going to modify a noun, so it's going to take case endings and that sort of things, but it takes on the nature of a verb, okay? So it has those two things together. How is it like a noun or an adjective? As I just suggested, it's going to have case, gender, and number, okay? We're familiar with case, gender, number. That was lots of Module 1 stuff when we talked about the Greek system, the nouns and nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, all that kind of stuff. That's the cases and numbers we're going to be using, okay? How is it like a verb? Well, it has aspect and it has voice, just like verbs we've been learning, and it's going to be built on verbal roots. So think about this for a second. We're taking a verbal root that has aspect and voice and those tools we've learned, and then we're going to take case endings with case, gender, number, and all that, and we're going to push those together, okay? That's the synthesis of what we're doing this class period and for the next couple class periods with participles, okay? So this means that participles have a lot going on. They have kind of two different worlds that are colliding, and for that reason, they're complex, okay? But as I said, it's not a lot that's new, it's just coming together, synthesized in a new way, okay? Mount says this: the key to understanding the meaning of participles is to recognize that their significance is primarily one of aspect, that is, type of action. This is the genius, the essence of participles. They do not necessarily indicate when an action occurs, okay? So let me say more about that. Everything we've learned so far have been indicative verbs, okay, within the indicative mood. We're not in the indicative mood anymore. Participles are just kind of outside of mood and somewhat outside of time, okay? So sometimes we'll encounter words that we'll talk about as completed action. That's going to kind of sound like past tense, but they're not necessarily talking about time in the same way that Greek tense is, okay? When you think tense, you think past, present, future. Participles aren't doing that so much, okay? It may be working with a verb that has a past, present, or future tense to it, but the participle itself won't, even though sometimes the translations may sound like that, okay? And when we talk about the translations, let me show you kind of what we mean by that. Participles do not have augments because there's no past time, right? This is out of the indicative. And I say they sort of don't have past time again because they're going to kind of sound like that, okay? So note that participles aren't going to have augments on the front like we've seen with verbs. But we are still going to have these three different ways to talk about them: imperfect or continual aspect. We're not talking about tense here, but continual aspect. We would translate a Greek participle to say while he was saying, okay? So you see there's a temporal, there's a time element to that, while he was saying. There's the ing word at the end, while he was saying, okay? So that would be one kind of aspect. That would be a continual aspect, okay? Then we would have the aorist, or the undefined participles, and we would translate those as completed action. And notice kind of the suggested translation there, after he said. Now notice for that one, we don't have an ing. What's up with that? Well, again, remember that Greek participles cover a wider range of usage than they do in English. So for that reason, the overlap is not going to be, it's not going to be a one-to-one correspondence there, right? So aorist or undefined participles we're going to translate as completed action, like that, after he said. And again, that sounds like past tense, even though strictly speaking it's not. There's almost not enough there for us to tell whether it's past, present, or future. We would need more of the sentence to translate, okay? And then finally, a perfect idea for a participle would be completed action whose results are still felt later on. And so this we would translate as after having said. Okay, now I realize that's kind of a mouthful. How is after having said that different than after he said? Well, it's kind of not. And this is just one of those places where we'll kind of put these hooks on there as far as like, this is how we'll translate them so that we know that we're dealing with a perfect or an aorist or whatever. But in some ways it's hard to bring all of that info out of the Greek into the English, right? And so this is where we just see the limitations of translation, is it's just not a perfect one-to-one correspondence, okay? And we just have to be aware of that and careful about that, all right? So let's talk about the usage of participles. Before we form them, I want you to understand how they're used, because there's two basic ways, okay? There's two basic uses for the participle. The first one is the adverbial participle. Now, what is an adverb? An adverb is a word that modifies a verb. And it's got the word verb right in there for you to remind you about that, okay? An adverb is just a word that modifies a verb. So if it's an adverbial participle, what do you think the participle is going to be doing? Yeah, it's going to be modifying a verb, right? It's going to be working with a verb. Good. So an adverbial participle tells us something about a verb, such as, and here we get back to the verse of the day, answering the crowd, Jesus said. Or in the verse that we looked at, it just said, and Jesus answered him. But it really says, if you look at the Greek, it says, answering, Jesus said. And this is super common, okay? There's the he said verb, but then we put a participle in there as well, the answering, okay? Epekrithes. That's going to go in there as a participle. This is kind of a Hebraism. Okay, we see this in Hebrew a lot, where there's kind of this doubling up of the action of a verb. In the Old Testament, it'll say, you know, he got up and went, or he turned and he saw, or he opened his mouth and he spoke, that sort of thing, where there's this doubling up of the action of a verb. Very common to do in Hebrew. Not as common in Greek, but remember, Koine Greek in the New Testament is so influenced by Judaism and by the Hebrew-speaking world that some of this just shows up in the New Testament as we would expect, okay? Because that's the broth, that's the soil that the garden is growing out of, right? So we see some of that going on. And so we see this doubling up of the action of a verb with a participle there, okay? So answering the crowd, Jesus said. The answering would be the participle. The Jesus would be the subject, said would be the main verb in that case, okay? Now, the second way a participle can be used is an adjectival participle. Now, what is an adjective? An adjective is a word that modifies a noun or a pronoun, right? Okay, so an adjectival participle is going to do the same thing. It's going to tell us something about a noun. It's going to work with a noun. For example, the ones believing in my name will be set free, okay? Can you see the participle in that sentence? Yeah, it's believing. And what noun is it working with? The one right before it, the ones. So that phrase, the ones believing, that whole thing is like the participle idea, okay? And we'll talk about that here in just a little bit, okay? Couple other notes to put in your notebook as we're going along, okay? There's a lot of kind of pre-info here, and I promise we'll try to make this all make sense here in just a little bit. But the tense of the participle is going to be built on either the present, aorist, or perfect stem, is going to tell us the aspect, okay? So kind of like we saw with verbs. With verbs, we had tense and we had aspect, but we always reminded you that aspect was more important, right? With that one exception about the future verbs, okay? With participles, we're going to use those words, present, aorist, perfect, but we're really going to be talking aspect when we're using those, okay? So we talk about a present tense participle, what we mean there is continual aspect. When we talk about an aorist, we mean completed aspect. And we talk about perfect, we talk about that, perfect style aspect, which is, action completed in the past that continues into the future. But those are going to be the three tense words we use with participles, okay? Now, the case of the participle is going to tell us which noun the participle agrees with in case, gender, number, okay? Particularly for adjectival participles, that's going to be important, okay? Now, adverbial participles are still going to have case. It's just doing something a little bit different, okay? So, let's talk about present participles first, and we'll start building these one at a time, okay? So, the present participle is built on the present tense stem. It describes continuous action, like I said, okay? So we're using that word present, but we don't mean like time present. We mean aspectually, it's continual. So we're going to translate those as while throwing, okay? While throwing. By the way, if throw was the verb that we were trying to translate, okay? This is the adverbial participle that we're learning first, which means it's going to modify a verb, okay? Now, there's a sentence here for practice. Feel free to pause and read it on your own and try to translate as best you can. There's some stuff you don't know here, but here's a practice sentence. I'll go ahead and read it for you here as well, okay? Ha anthropos apethane didaskon tain koinein, okay? The man, apethane, died, didaskon, that's our participle, teaching, and since this is, you don't necessarily know this yet, but this is a present participle, we're going to say while teaching, tain koinein, which is koine, or Greek, right? The man died while teaching Greek. And Mount says humorously in parentheses in his book, he died happy, right? If you died teaching Greek, you die happy, right? So here we have our participle didaskon there, and it's modifying, it's working with the die verb, right? It's telling us something about how this guy died, which in this case, while he was teaching, okay? You see how that works? All right. So this is an adverbial participle, which means it's modifying the verb like we just said, but it's still going to agree in case, gender, number with a noun, in this case, the subject, okay? In this sentence, that's ha anthropos. So we have a masculine, nominative, singular case ending, okay? And another important note, okay, put an asterisk or a star by this in your notes, that the adverbial participle will never have an article, okay? So, I don't know if we mentioned this yet, but participles can take an article. Since they're taking case, gender, number, they can take a definite article out front if they want to because, again, they're versatile in that way, right? But this is going to be a real key for us. This can help us because adverbial participles, if they're working with verbs, they're never going to have a definite article, okay? So therefore, if they do have a definite article, we know that it's not behaving adverbally, it's behaving adjectively, okay? I know that's a lot of language. If you need to pause the video and just take a deep breath, or maybe go back to the beginning and watch this again and read through your notes and just kind of, that's okay. Remember, we're slowing down. We're wading into the pool slowly because, again, there's a lot going on, okay? There's a lot going on. Let's go ahead and build present active participles, okay? So we're going to start with that present tense stem that we've become so familiar with. It's that lexical form of the stem. We're going to start with that, okay? We're going to put a connecting vowel on there. Remember, we don't care a lot about connecting vowels. They're just there to smooth out pronunciation for Greek speakers. And then we're going to have a participle morpheme. What is that? Well, It's kind of like a tense formative, except it's unique to participles. Okay, but it's that same idea. It's something we're putting in the middle of the word to help us identify what's going on. Okay, in this case, the example here is a new tau. Okay, so we've got the present tense stem, connecting vowel, the participle morpheme, and then we're going to put case endings on the end. Okay, but notice those first three elements there end. That new tau is kind of the end of that, the effective end of that part of the word so far. And notice that ends in a consonant. So if it ends in a consonant, what sort of endings are we going to need from a case perspective? Yeah, we're going to need third declension endings, right? You remember that back in the day, chapter 10 of the Mounds textbook? We're going to need to put third declension endings on there since it ends with that consonant, okay? So we're going to have to go back and review third declension endings most likely, okay? Because that's going to be a challenge. We're going to have to make sure we're up to speed with those. And so the result is we get pistuantes, okay? Pistuantes, which means believing or while believing, okay? Now, here's the little chart for you of participle morphemes that we know so far. This will get a little bit more complex, but notice for active verbs, new tau is going to signal, if that new tau that we see in the word there, that participle morpheme, that's telling us that this is an active participle rather than middle or passive, and that it's masculine or neuter. Okay, it's telling us those two things. Now we could tell that probably from the ending, okay, but not the active part, but we could tell whether it was masculine or neuter. But in this case, it's telling us those two things. It's telling us something about the verbal aspect and something about the noun aspect, okay? If it was feminine, it would take usa, omicron, upsilon, sigma, alpha, usa. That would be in the middle. So that would tell us that it's active and that it's feminine, okay? And then if it was middle or passive, it would take either mana for masculine and neuter or mane for feminine. I can tell you that those middle passive participle morphemes are incredibly regular. Okay, it almost never changes from that mene, which is just so common. Okay, we'll see that a lot. Okay, so let's look at a paradigm right here. Big scary paradigm. We're going to need masculine, feminine, and neuter for these because we've got these three different genders we have to cover. It can work with all different kinds of genders, and so you see there, luon is the nominative singular. But then when you go down, look at genitive singular, luantas, luanti, luanta, those are all third declension endings. Luantes, luantone, luusi, notice no new tau there. It's dropped off because of that sigma ending, okay? That sigma ending has caused the new tau to drop off, so we got to be careful about that one. And then luantas at the end. Look at feminine. This is a first declension. We don't have the new tau because we've got usa instead, right? So it's taking first declension endings. So luusa, luuses, luuse, luusan, luusai, luuson, luusais, and luusas. Okay? That's what it looks like up and down. And then neuter looks very much like the masculine, except it's different in a few places. Nominative singular and accusative singular, and then nominative plural and accusative plural, but notice it's luanta, like the accusative singular. So I don't know if you remember this word that we learned back in the day, about chapter 10 or so. It was pas. Do you remember this? Here's what the paradigm looks like. Pas, pantas, panti, panta, right? It means all, each, or every, okay, depending on how it's used, okay? This is essentially the exact same form of the participle you're looking at. Those endings, if we cross off the front, it looks exactly the same, okay? So if you memorized the pas paradigm back in the day, that's essentially what we're looking at here. If you see it next to each other, you see how similar it is, right? And so that can help you. This is that 3-1-3 construction, okay? So again, hopefully we can build on to what we already know rather than building it from scratch. Okay, so if we're going to build a present middle passive participle, we're going to have a present tense stem. We're going to have that connecting vowel again. We're going to have the participle morpheme. In this case, it's the mana or the mene, depending on if it's masculine or feminine. And then our case endings. So we get luamanoi, okay, luamanoi. that's what it looks like. Let me show you the paradigm for that. This one is going to be much more familiar to you because this is going to be a 2-1-2 construction, right? Second declension for masculine and neuter, first declension for feminine, okay? So this looks essentially like logos does, or, agathos, or the first adjective, where we have three different genders here that we have to look at. That's essentially what it looks like. It's the front half is a verb, the back half is a noun, and we just need to be able to recognize both of those, okay? Now here's the master participles chart. These are the morphemes. There's more information on this. You'll have this as a handout. There's more information than you need here right now, but it's just trying to give you all of that information, the nu tau, the usa, the monomene, some other stuff we haven't learned yet. We'll keep coming back to this every time we learn a new type of participles, okay? All right, so at this point, we're going to keep going and learn aorist participles too, about how we build those, okay? If you're at a stopping point, that's okay. Feel free to pause this and come back to it. No big deal. If you feel like you can keep going a little bit more, we're going to keep going here. But, remember, this is your pace, so decide how you want to do this and what you want to do. But if you want to keep going, let me ask you this question. Knowing what you know already about how participles are formed, how do you think the first aorist would form participles? Think about that for a second. Well, what we're going to start with is the unaugmented first aorist tense stem, okay? So that stem that we would see with the aorist, but without an augment on the front, right? Because we're not in the indicative, okay? So an unaugmented first aorist tense stem. We're going to put the tense formative on there, okay, for a first aorist, which is that sigma alpha, the sa, okay? Because we still have tense in a sense, right? We still have aspect. We're using tense words to talk about aspects. Then we're going to have that participle morpheme again, the nu tau. So since we have sa and the nu tau, we're going to get sant in the middle. And then we're going to have our case endings on the end. So we get lusantes, okay? Now, when you come to identify this, we're going to use that same biblical Greek made easy process that we use for identifying verbs, right? We're going to try to identify the lexical form. We're going to look to the left. We're going to look to the middle. And when we look to the middle on something like this and we see sant in there, that's going to tell us a ton, isn't it? It's going to tell us that it's aorist, that's first aorist specifically. It's going to tell us that it's active, that it's masculine or neuter. Man, that's done like half the work for us already, right? And so if we can just memorize those participle morphemes and the tense formatives and the way those work together, that's going to go a long way, okay? So middle then is going to be essentially the same. We're just going to use that mene participle morpheme. So instead we get lusamanoi, okay? Lusamanoi. What do you think the passive is going to be for the aorist? Remember, passive has always been a little bit weird in the aorist. Instead of the normal morpheme, it takes, what, the theta, okay? So in this case, rather than theta eta, it's theta epsilon, okay? So we get luthentes, okay? Notice it takes that active, that nu tau, active participle morpheme, kind of like how aorist passive verbs took active endings. Well, aorist passive participles take active participle morphemes. I don't know why. Aorist just likes to be difficult in that way. We just have to be aware of it. But luthentes is the result there, okay? So those are what first aorist participles look like. And again, we're just trying to recognize those parts so we let the word tell us what it's doing. We're like detectives coming to the scene, looking at the evidence, and using that evidence to tell what's going on, okay? Here's a paradigm for you for first aorist participles. You can look this over. Notice the feminine, okay? Notice the feminine takes sa instead of nu tau. When we were looking at present, it was nu tau for masculine and neuter, and feminine was usa. With the aorist, it's nu tau with the masculine and the neuter, but the feminine is sa. So because we have sa tense formative and sa participle morpheme, we get lusasa, lusases, lusase, right? Sounds fun to say. It's kind of goofy, but that's it. Again, is that interesting enough? Is that weird enough to stand out to you? Yeah, it probably is, right? So that's good news. The weirder, the better when we're trying to memorize stuff because it gives our brains hooks. Also have the first aorist passive there for you if you want to look at that one to see how that works. But let me ask you this. Knowing what you know already, how do you think the second aorist would form participles? Yeah, it's just going to start with that unaugmented second aorist tense stem, which is that changed stem, right? It's different. That's how we tell second aorist, is because they have that stem change going on. We're going to add a connecting vowel, we're going to add a participle morpheme, and then we're going to add our endings. So for active, that's going to be balantes, okay? Could you recognize that as a second aorist participle? We've got that different stem, we've got the participle morpheme, we've got case endings, right? This is the same trick every time. It's just there's these couple little nuances to tell the difference in the tenses slash the aspects, right? For middle, we've got gen there for genomai, which is our changed stem. We've got mena for the middle, and then our ending. So we get genomenoi, okay? So here's what the passive looks like. We add these different parts, connecting vowel, participle morpheme, and we get graphentes. That's hard to tell that that's passive, but notice the asterisk there. Of the verbs that occur 50 times or more in the New Testament, none of them have second aorist passive participles, okay? So that's something to note, that of the verbs that you know already and the verbs you're going to learn through the first two modules of Biblical Greek Made Easy, none of them have second aorist passive participles, okay? So we show you that one that's a little bit goofy and hard to identify, but they just don't show up very much in the New Testament, okay? So don't stress about that. Well, guys, we made it through the first class talking about participles. I know that was a lot of information. We went deep, but again, we want to just kind of wade into it slowly. Even though it's a lot of information, we just want to sit with this for a while. We want to practice. We want to review a little bit, but we don't want this to be like the breaking point for us, okay? We learned all about participles in English and in Greek. We learned about participle morphemes. We learned about present and aorist participles and the rules that govern those. That's a lot. We learned the foundation of what participles are today, all that kind of stuff. And so just take it easy, take it slow, practice some sentences. Happy studying, and we'll see you next time.